Before we get started, if you're enjoying this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's dive into an incredible story of survival, mystery, and hope in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The thermometer hadn't moved above -45 degrees for 3 days straight. Marcus had stopped checking it obsessively after the second week. Denial was easier than confronting the brutal reality of the Alaskan wilderness in January. The cabin, if you could call it that, was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, perched on the edge of a frozen valley in the Brooks Range. Snow had drifted so high against the eastern wall that it blocked half the window, transforming daylight into a perpetual gray twilight that made it impossible to distinguish morning from afternoon. He sat on the edge of the single bunk, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, despite the dying fire in the small iron stove. 60 degrees below zero. The number felt abstract, almost meaningless, a temperature so extreme that it transcended human understanding and became something mythological instead. At that cold, gasoline congealed into sludge, steel became brittle enough to shatter, and human skin could develop frostbite in less than 5 minutes of exposure. Marcus pulled the thick wool blanket tighter around his shoulders, drawing what little warmth remained from the layers he'd assembled over the past month. Thermals, then fleece, then a heavy wool sweater, then the military-grade down jacket he'd found hanging on a hook when he first arrived. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been left here with almost nothing, yet the cabin's previous occupant had apparently abandoned supplies as if expecting to return soon. They never did. The silence was the hardest part, not the cold, though that was relentless. Not the hunger, though his stomach had stopped making demands around day 12, as if his body had accepted the scarcity and resigned itself to rationing whatever reserves remained. It was the silence, absolute, suffocating, pressing down on him like a physical weight. Outside, the wind occasionally howled through the gaps in the cabin's frame, but that somehow made the silence deeper between those moments. It reminded him that he was utterly alone in an expanse of white that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. He'd tried to piece together why he was here. The last thing he remembered with clarity was the truck stop outside Fairbanks. He'd been hitchhiking south, working odd jobs, living hand-to-mouth the way he'd done for the past 5 years since leaving Seattle. A man in a grey parka had offered him $500 to help transport supplies to a remote cabin. Easy money. Isolated work. No questions asked. Marcus had asked none. Desperation had a way of simplifying ethics. The drive had taken most of the night on roads that gradually deteriorated from asphalt to gravel to something barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest. When they'd arrived, the man had handed him the cash, showed him inside the cabin and said, "Stay put for a month. There's supplies. Don't leave. When the time comes, someone will collect you." Then the sound of the truck engine fading into distance, swallowed by snow and darkness. That had been 32 days ago. No one had come. Marcus rose stiffly from the bunk. His joints protested every movement now, and shuffled to the small window that wasn't completely blocked. The view was unchanging, white upon white, interrupted only by the dark silhouettes of pine trees struggling against the wind. Somewhere in that landscape, there were mountains. Somewhere beyond that, other human beings. But they might as well have been on another planet. He'd rationed the canned food methodically, calculating his consumption against the supplies available. Beans, soups, vegetables in heavy syrup, canned meat that he tried not to think too hard about. There was enough for perhaps another 2 weeks if he reduced portions further, though he was already eating less than 1,200 calories a day. Enough to survive, barely, if survival was all that mattered. The problem was that survival without purpose, without hope, without any reasonable expectation of rescue, was a slow form of dying anyway. The radio had been his first hope. A battery-powered unit, ancient and covered in dust, sat on a shelf above the sink. He'd found it during his second day, when desperation had driven him to search every inch of the cabin, trying to understand what kind of operation he'd become entangled in. The radio had worked. He'd managed to raise a few stations. Through the crackling static, distant voices discussing weather reports and road conditions and the banality of life beyond this frozen prison. But no amount of shouting into the microphone had yielded any response. His voice simply disappeared into the electromagnetic void. If you're enjoying the story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Now let's see what Marcus discovers next. The cabin groaned around him, wood contracting in the extreme cold. Marcus had learned not to fear these sounds. They were simply the physics of temperature at work, the normal vocabulary of a structure pushed to its limits. What he feared was silence, interrupted by sounds that didn't belong. So far, nothing had happened. No inexplicable noises, no signs that anything else existed within miles of this place. He returned to the bunk and pulled out the notebook he'd found on the cabin's shelf, apparently abandoned by whoever had lived here before. The previous entries were dated, sporadic, and cryptic. Supplies low, winter coming early. They promised twice weekly checkups, still waiting. The last entry was from 3 years ago. 3 years. The handwriting had become increasingly erratic toward the end, the final words barely legible. No one's coming. Have to decide. The page after that was blank. Marcus had stared at that blank page for a very long time. Now, as the fire died to embers and the temperature continued its inexorable descent, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow, when it was light enough to see, he would explore the cabin more thoroughly. Not the main room where he'd spent every waking hour, but the storage area in the back corner. The locked door he'd noticed on his first day, but had been too confused and frightened to investigate. Perhaps there was something there. Supplies, information, or perhaps just another mystery in a situation that seemed designed to generate nothing but questions. As sleep began to claim him despite the cold, Marcus didn't know that the discovery waiting in that locked room would change everything about his understanding of captivity, survival, and hope itself. The lock on the storage door was a simple padlock, corroded by years of exposure to humidity and temperature fluctuations. Marcus found a screwdriver among the basic tools scattered in a drawer: hammer, pliers, a flashlight with dead batteries, matches, and a multi-tool so old it might have been military issue. The screwdriver slipped easily behind the lock's mechanism. 3 careful twists, a moment of resistance, and then the corroded metal gave way with a sound like bone cracking. The door swung inward, revealing darkness that his flashlight, powered by 2 batteries he'd cannibalized from the radio's backup pack, could barely penetrate. The beam caught dust particles suspended in air that hadn't circulated in years, dancing in the light like ghost plankton. Slowly, details resolved themselves. Wooden shelves, boxes, something that might have been furniture covered with cloth. Marcus stepped inside, his breath coming faster than the exertion warranted. The temperature was no warmer here, if anything colder, but the air felt different, stale and time-worn, in a way that suggested this space had been sealed deliberately. The boxes were labeled. That was the first surprise. Military-style stenciling, faded but still legible. Medical supplies, documentation, equipment, electronics. Someone had been very organized, very methodical. This wasn't the chaotic stockpile of a hermit. This was the carefully maintained inventory of an institution. Marcus opened the first medical box. Inside were pharmaceutical supplies that looked like they'd been professionally packaged. Antibiotics still in blister packs, pain medication, anti-inflammatory medications, bandages of various sizes, sutures, sterile needles. At the bottom, a logbook. He opened it with trembling fingers. The entries were dated spanning nearly 8 years. The handwriting varied. Multiple people had written in this book. Subject 7 exhibiting increased anxiety. Administered sedative as protocol requires. Subject 7 temperature elevated, possible infection, monitoring. Subject 7 attempting communication, reminded of isolation protocol, compliance maintained. Subject 7, the words seemed to echo in the small room. Marcus set the logbook down carefully, as if sudden movement might cause it to explode. He opened the documentation box. Inside were files, thick and densely typed. He pulled out a random one. The header read, "Long-term psychological response to extended isolation, research parameters and preliminary findings, academic papers, research methodology, statistical analysis of behavioral degradation under controlled isolation conditions." He understood then, not all at once, but in cascading revelations that felt like falling. The cabin wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a kidnapping in the traditional sense. It was a research facility. He wasn't a prisoner. He was a subject, an experiment. And the man in the grey parka had been a recruiter, and the $500 had been compensation for participation in what someone had very deliberately designed and implemented. The equipment box contained laptops, power inverters, recording equipment, everything needed to monitor someone remotely, to document their deterioration, to maintain the experiment indefinitely. There were cameras. He found 4 of them mounted in the cabin's corners when he returned to the main room, so carefully placed that they blended seamlessly with their surroundings, so old they might have been inactive for years. That discovery, that realization that every moment in the cabin had potentially been recorded, observed, analyzed, felt somehow worse than the cold, worse than the solitude. It transformed his suffering from an accident into something intentional, designed, calibrated for maximum psychological effect. Marcus found himself laughing, a sound that terrified him because it didn't sound entirely sane. He laughed until he couldn't breathe, until tears froze on his cheeks, until the laughter collapsed into something between crying and hyperventilation. When the panic finally subsided, his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. Someone had abandoned this experiment. The last entries in the logbook were dated 3 years ago. Whatever institutional framework had created this facility, whatever research program had deemed this suffering valuable, had apparently ended. Perhaps defunded, perhaps discovered, perhaps simply deemed inconclusive and forgotten, which meant that no one was coming to collect him, no one was monitoring the cameras anymore. No one remembered that Subject 7 was slowly starving and freezing in an isolated cabin in Alaska. He was genuinely alone, more alone than he'd been before, because now he understood that no rescue was coming. There was no outside authority that knew where he was. No one was tracking his location. No one would miss him or search for him or ever know his name. Leave a comment below. I'd love to know what you think about Marcus's discovery so far. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. But the research files contained something else. Buried in the equipment box, under layers of equipment manuals and cables, Marcus found a plastic folder. Inside were photographs of the cabin, taken from different angles, maps with the cabin's location marked in red, and most importantly, technical specifications for a radio system that wasn't the ancient battery-powered model in the main room. According to the notes, there was a more sophisticated communication system installed in the cabin. A system designed for long-distance transmission that would work even in the Arctic wilderness, powered by a solar array and battery backup. The notes indicated that it should be located in the elevated compartment above the eastern wall insulation layer. Marcus had never looked above the wall insulation. He'd accepted the cabin's limitations as fixed facts, never questioning whether there might be hidden spaces, concealed systems, secrets buried literally within the structure itself. Tomorrow, he would investigate. Tomorrow, he would climb into the cramped space above the insulation and search for a radio that might actually work, that might actually connect him to the outside world. For the first time in 32 days, Marcus felt something that might generously be called hope. The insulation above the eastern wall was thick, yellowed fiberglass that released particulates into the air when Marcus disturbed it, making him cough despite covering his mouth and nose with cloth. He'd had to clear away snow from inside the cabin's upper reaches, where wind had found its way through gaps, and the work was delicate. Too much disturbance risked further structural compromise in temperatures that made any damage potentially catastrophic. His makeshift ladder, 2 chairs stacked on the bunk, held his weight precariously. Marcus had never been particularly afraid of heights, but dangling in a cabin that seemed held together by little more than determination and paint at 60 degrees below zero made him question his previous relationship with mortality. The compartment, when he finally breached it, was smaller than the technical drawings had suggested. Barely more than 3 feet of crawl space between the ceiling joists and the outer roof. But the radio equipment was there. A unit that looked like it belonged in a military communications center, all dials and antennae and incomprehensible controls. Bundled beside it were manuals, laminated instruction sheets, and a logbook. Marcus photographed the radio with his memory, knowing his hands wouldn't cooperate well enough to navigate its complexity in freezing conditions. He descended carefully and returned to the main room where his fingers might eventually regain enough dexterity to function. The radio's logbook was the key. Unlike the medical documentation, this book contained operational records. The previous tenant, Subject 7's predecessor, Marcus realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, had apparently maintained this equipment. The entries showed successful transmissions, regular check-ins with command, and increasingly desperate attempts to understand why transmissions had been discontinued. The final entry was dated 3 years ago. Transmitted emergency distress signal on all frequencies with no response. Equipment functional. Signal failure must be institutional. Awaiting further instructions. No further instructions ever came, but the technical manual provided the activation sequence. Marcus studied the laminated cards with intense concentration, committing the procedures to memory, then took them to the radio compartment where he could work through the steps methodically. The unit powered on, a small miracle that electronics this old would still function. The screen illuminated, displaying diagnostic information in a green font that seemed to glow in the darkness. System operational, the display read. Last transmission, 1,087 days ago. Emergency protocols engaged. Transmit? YN? Marcus's hands shook as he navigated the interface. The radio didn't just transmit, it could send encrypted messages, establish secure connections, utilize satellite relay systems. It was far more sophisticated than anything remotely resembling civilian equipment. This was a military-grade communication system maintained by someone who clearly understood its value. He composed a message carefully, keeping it simple. Subject 7, designate Marcus Holloway. Cabin location per installed GPS. Currently operational. Request immediate assistance. Research facility abandoned. Requesting emergency extraction. The cursor blinked, waiting. Marcus's finger hovered over the transmit button. What happened if he pressed it? Who would receive the message? The military, a civilian authority, the research organization that had imprisoned him. Would rescue come, or would he be recaptured by the very people who'd created this nightmare? The hunger, the cold, the isolation, those things could kill him slowly, but rescue from the wrong people might kill him differently. There might be reasons, legitimate reasons, why this facility had been abandoned. There might be legal implications, governmental denials, classified operations that no one wanted documented. Pressing transmit might end his physical captivity while ensuring his permanent silencing through other, more permanent means. He nearly deleted the message, nearly shut down the radio, and pretended he'd never found it. But desperation, he realized, was a stronger force than caution. He was already dying here. Slowly, perhaps, but inevitably. The only question was whether he'd die here forgotten or die fighting to be remembered. He pressed transmit. The radio emitted a high-frequency squeal that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then returned to its previous state. The screen indicated successful transmission. The message was gone, sent out into the electromagnetic void, traveling towards satellites that might or might not acknowledge its presence. For 2 days, nothing happened. Marcus rationed his hope along with his food, unwilling to believe that transmission alone guaranteed anything. He'd made contact with the outside world, but he still didn't know if anyone was listening. Didn't know if the systems on the other end were still active. Didn't know if rescue was days away or impossibly distant. On the 3rd day, the radio emitted a sound he hadn't heard before, a gentle chime followed by the display shifting to show an incoming message. Text appeared letter by letter as if someone on the other end was typing directly to him. Message received. Identity confirmed through biometric records. Stand by for situation assessment. Stand by. Not help is coming. Not remain calm. Simply stand by. The military phrase for holding position, waiting for further instructions, continuing to exist in a state of suspended animation. Marcus waited through that day and the next. The radio chimed twice more. The first message directed him to confirm his physical condition. The second directed him to inventory supplies and report back. He complied, documenting his resources, his health status, everything they asked for. He understood that he wasn't being interrogated. He was being evaluated. Someone on the other end was deciding what to do with him, whether he was valuable enough to extract, whether he represented an asset or a liability. It took 5 more days. 5 days of waiting, of checking the radio obsessively, of trying not to catastrophize about what the delay might mean. Then a message that changed everything. Extraction scheduled. Helicopter transport in 72 hours. Prepare for immediate departure. Confirm receipt. Marcus confirmed. And then he allowed himself to believe that he might actually survive this. That the cabin, the cold, the isolation, it was almost finished. Almost behind him. He didn't know, as he made that decision, that the extraction would bring its own mysteries, that learning why he'd been imprisoned was the beginning of understanding something far darker than simple research gone wrong. The helicopter appeared on the 4th day, rather than the 3rd, emerging from low clouds like a black insect cutting through the grey sky. Marcus had been monitoring the radio's signal strength, watching the strength indicator climb as the aircraft approached. He'd prepared himself physically as much as was possible, eaten and hydrated, dressed in every layer he possessed, carried the documentation files from the storage room into the main cabin where they'd be impossible to ignore. The downdraft from the rotor blades cleared snow from the cabin's roof with apocalyptic violence. Debris spiraled into the air, obscuring visibility, transforming the world into a white chaos that seemed to swallow the helicopter itself. Marcus thought briefly that this was how people died, not through dramatic accidents, but through rescue operations gone wrong, through the machinery of salvation malfunctioning at the crucial moment. But the aircraft descended precisely, pilots trained for exactly these conditions, and worse. A side door opened. 2 figures in full cold-weather tactical gear descended via rope, impossibly fast, impossibly coordinated, and approached the cabin. They moved like military, which meant they probably were military, which meant that what had been happening in this place had been official enough to warrant government involvement. The lead figure pounded on the cabin door. Marcus opened it, and the cold rushed in like something alive and vicious. The figure stepped inside, followed by their partner, and after a moment of assessing silence, the lead figure pulled down their balaclava. It was a woman, perhaps in her mid-40s, with the kind of face that suggested she'd seen things that had hardened it against further harm. "Marcus Holloway?" she asked, her voice professional, clipped, expecting confirmation rather than genuine uncertainty. "That's my name," Marcus replied. His voice sounded strange after weeks of disuse. hoarse and unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. "I'm Captain Elena Rodriguez, Department of Defense. We're here to extract you to medical evaluation and debriefing." She gestured to the storage room, visible through the open door. "Are those the research files?" "Yes. Everything the previous subject left, plus my own records." Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted slightly. Calculation, reassessment. "Grab what you can carry. We have less than 20 minutes on the ground before fuel requirements force departure." The evacuation was efficiently brutal. Marcus grabbed the most important files, left the rest, and descended the rope ladder while wind tried to tear him into the sky. The helicopter's interior was surprisingly warm after weeks in the cabin. Heated seats, climate control. The sensory shock was almost overwhelming. Temperature, sound, motion, humanity. As they lifted away, Marcus watched the cabin diminish below them. It had been his entire world for 55 days. Now it was just a small structure in an enormous white wilderness, disappearing into distance and perspective. Rodriguez sat across from him, secured by harness, studying him with unsettling intensity. "Tell me," she said, "what do you remember before arriving at the cabin?" Marcus recounted the truck stop, the man in the grey parka, the drive, the initial abandonment. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, her expression remaining neutral in a way that suggested she already knew the answers she was asking for. "The research files indicate that you were never informed of the nature of the experiment?" she asked. "No, I thought it was just, I don't know, a paying gig, something off the books. I certainly never consented to psychological torture." Rodriguez's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "That complicates things legally. The previous subjects, they all signed documentation, granted informed consent, even if that consent was obtained through coercion and misrepresentation. I signed nothing?" "Exactly." Rodriguez pulled up a tablet, showed him documents, release forms, waivers, consent agreements bearing signatures that weren't his. "This was created for you, backdated. Whoever brought you in wanted plausible deniability if something went wrong. If you died, the documentation would have protected them from investigation." The casual way she described potential death, his death, seemed designed to test his reaction. Marcus refused to provide one. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Rodriguez said, "the person who brought you here, the man in the grey parka, he was running an unauthorized operation. He was not military. He was not government. He was a researcher named Dr. David Brennan, and he was conducting experiments that violated federal law, international law, and basic human rights. His facility here was one of 3 isolation research sites operating without authorization. The military discovered the operations 2 years ago, but Brennan vanished before we could locate him. 2 years ago. But the research files showed we maintained the facilities in inactive status," Rodriguez interrupted. "Didn't shut them down immediately because we needed to understand the scope of what was happening, who was funding him, whether there were other researchers involved. We were building a case. Then we discovered that new subjects had been brought to the facilities, you being the most recent." The helicopter banked, and through the window Marcus could see the mountains beginning to give way to forest land, to the gradual emergence of civilization. Distant lights that meant human presence, infrastructure, the world. "What happened to the previous subjects?" he asked. Rodriguez hesitated, and that hesitation told Marcus everything he needed to know. Most were recovered in functional condition. Their psychological profiles varied significantly. Some adapted to their isolation in ways that suggest potential PTSD, complex trauma responses. Others, some of them experienced breaks from which recovery seems unlikely. The isolation wasn't just an experiment, it was psychological warfare applied to civilian populations. "And you're telling me this because..." "Because," Rodriguez said, "we need you to understand that what happened to you wasn't normal, wasn't standard, wasn't sanctioned. We're trying to help you, but we also need information from you, Everything you remember about Brennan, everything you observed about the research apparatus in the cabin, any identifying details about other researchers you might have encountered. Marcus looked out at the approaching civilization and understood that his captivity hadn't ended. It had merely transformed. Physical imprisonment traded for institutional involvement. Cold for bureaucracy. Isolation for something potentially more insidious. Integration into a system designed to contain knowledge, control narrative, ensure that whatever happened in that cabin remained compartmentalized and classified. But as the helicopter descended toward the military base visible in the distance, Marcus held on to one truth. He had survived. Whatever came next, debriefing, investigation, recovery, psychological repair, he had survived those 55 days when survival had seemed impossible. That counted for something, even if the cost had been higher than anyone who hadn't lived it could possibly understand. The military base sprawled across thousands of acres, a small city of infrastructure designed for purposes Marcus could only guess at. The helicopter descended toward a medical facility marked with red crosses, and within minutes of landing, Marcus was transferred to a clean room, provided with hot showers, clothes that fit properly, and medical evaluation that was thorough enough to suggest someone was concerned about his physical state. The base doctor, an older man named Chen, provided a detailed assessment. Severe malnutrition, early signs of frostbite that hadn't quite developed into tissue damage, dehydration and blood pressure so low, it was surprising he remained conscious. "Another few weeks," Chen said matter-of-factly, "and you wouldn't have made it through rescue. Your body was in the process of shutting down non-essential systems. Your core temperature was running 2 degrees low when you arrived." "I didn't know that," Marcus said. "No, because your body has incredibly sophisticated survival mechanisms. It was operating in crisis mode indefinitely. You didn't feel it actively because your nervous system was in a state of sustained stress that masked the deterioration." Chen wrote something in his electronic chart. "Fortunately, malnutrition without accompanying organ damage is largely reversible. You'll need careful refeeding. We can't shock your system with too much nutrition at once, but recovery is possible." Recovery was a strange word for the process that followed. Marcus was moved to a secure medical ward where his meals were monitored. His recovery measured in carefully controlled increments. Nurses checked his vitals obsessively. Doctors asked questions about his symptoms, his psychological state, his memories. Psychologists conducted extensive interviews designed to assess trauma response, potential for PTSD, capacity for cognitive function, and always, Rodriguez appeared with new questions about Brennan. What did he look like? What accent did he have? What were his apparent beliefs about the research? Had he mentioned funding sources, mentioned other facilities, mentioned other researchers? Marcus answered with whatever he could remember, but he understood what was happening. This wasn't recovery. This was debriefing, conducted under the guise of medical care. He was being emptied of useful information, his entire experience in the cabin transformed into intelligence that would feed into larger investigations. It was during the 3rd week of his hospitalization that Rodriguez brought someone else into the secure ward. An older woman, dressed in civilian clothes, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Director of the Department of Defense's Research Oversight Division. "We've read Captain Rodriguez's preliminary reports about your experience," Mitchell said, settling into a chair across from Marcus's bed. "We're trying to understand the scope of what Dr. Brennan was attempting, the research questions he was investigating. Rodriguez tells me you had access to his files. Some of them. I didn't have time to read everything, but you read enough to understand that this was organized, funded, and maintained as long-term research." Mitchell pulled up documents on a tablet. "We've been analyzing Brennan's materials, trying to reconstruct his methodology. He was measuring long-term psychological degradation under extreme isolation combined with physical hardship. The research parameters suggest he was working toward publishing findings in academic journals, seeking to establish himself as an authority on extreme stress response. He wanted academic credibility, Marcus said, using people as test subjects. Yes, which is remarkably common in human research history, though the specifics vary. Mitchell shifted forward slightly. What we're trying to determine is whether there was a larger institutional framework supporting his work, whether he was independent or part of a coordinated effort, whether there are other facilities, other subjects, other researchers operating similar operations. I can't help you with that. I was a prisoner. I didn't have access to information about anything beyond my own immediate experience. Mitchell smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. No, but your files provide interesting context. You had access to research documentation, medical records, technical specifications for communications equipment. That's more institutional material than most subjects would be exposed to. She paused, letting the implications settle. Which makes me wonder whether your presence there was accidental or whether you were specifically selected for reasons we haven't yet understood. The question hung in the sterile air between them. Marcus had never considered it, had accepted his capture as randomness, opportunity, bad luck. But Mitchell's perspective introduced a darker possibility. What if his selection had been deliberate? What if there was something about him specifically that made him valuable as a research subject? I was random, Marcus said, but heard the uncertainty in his own voice. Perhaps. Or perhaps whoever selected you understood something about your background, your psychology, your vulnerability to isolation and stress. Mitchell stood, indicating the conversation's end. We're going to be examining every aspect of how you were recruited. Every detail of your background, every connection to individuals who might have brought you to Brennan's attention. You'll need to provide us with complete biographical information. Everyone you've lived with, worked with, maintained contact with over the past 5 years. Why? I'm the victim here. Yes, Mitchell agreed, but victims can also be connections to larger systems. Sometimes they're not selected randomly. Sometimes they're selected because of who they know, or what they represent, or what their disappearance will tell interested observers. We need to know if you fit that profile. After Mitchell left, Marcus lay in the darkness of his secure room and wondered if he'd been selected for his vulnerability or for some other reason entirely. If his entire experience in the cabin had been premeditated, tailored specifically for him, designed to produce predictable psychological outcomes based on his individual susceptibility. The cold had been real. The isolation had been real. But the meaning behind those experiences that remained fundamentally unknowable, locked away in Brennan's psychology, in decisions made by people Marcus had never met, for purposes he might never fully understand. By week 4 of hospitalization, Marcus had regained enough weight that his clothes fit again, his frostbite had fully resolved, his blood pressure had normalized. Physically, he was approaching baseline health. Psychologically, the picture was more complicated. He'd been moved from the secure medical ward to a more standard recovery room, though recovery remained a misnomer for a space that was essentially confinement by different means. The room had windows, a luxury compared to the cabin, but doors that remained locked, access controlled by security personnel. It was during this period that Rodriguez brought him a stack of photographs and asked if he recognized anyone. The first image was Brennan, the man in the gray parka. Marcus nodded confirmation. The second image was another man, perhaps in his 50s, with academic credentials listed below. The third was a woman. The fourth was Rodriguez herself, younger, decades previous version, standing next to an older man in a military uniform. That's my father, Rodriguez explained. General Robert Rodriguez. He was involved in classified research programs in the 90s. Research on extreme stress response, isolation effects on cognitive function, psychological resilience in high-threat environments. She paused. Legitimate research, conducted with informed consent and ethical oversight, until someone stole his findings. Marcus understood the implication. Brennan worked on my father's research team for 3 years. He had access to all the methodologies, all the theoretical frameworks, all the findings. Then he left the military, disappeared for a decade, and resurfaced implementing that research privately, without oversight, without consent. Rodriguez's jaw tightened. My father died not knowing what happened to his work. Didn't know it was being used to torture people. Why are you telling me this? Because, Rodriguez said, I'm telling you why I've committed significant resources to investigating Brennan. Why I've prioritized bringing you in, ensuring your recovery, ensuring that whatever he was doing comes to light. This isn't just institutional interest in you, this is personal. My father's research, my family's intellectual property, was corrupted and weaponized by someone they trusted. The revelation didn't comfort Marcus, but it recontextualized Rodriguez's involvement. Her intensity, her persistence, her commitment to finding answers, it was fueled by something beyond professional obligation. Over the following week, Rodriguez brought him more information. Other former military researchers who'd worked on stress response studies and subsequently taken lucrative contracts with private organizations. Funding sources that were difficult to trace but appeared to originate from foreign interests. Academic journals that had published Brennan's work under pseudonyms, research that should have been flagged as ethical violations but had somehow passed peer review. There's a network, Rodriguez explained. Not formal, not centralized, but coordinated. Researchers who've left military or government service and are now conducting privatized human research. Stress testing, psychological manipulation, building intelligence about how humans respond to extreme conditions and deprivation. Whoever's funding them has strategic interest in that knowledge. For what purpose? Marcus asked. Interrogation technique development, psychological warfare, training, understanding the limits of human endurance and compliance under coercion. Rodriguez pulled up more documents. And testing methodologies to be deployed on captured populations. These aren't pure research facilities, they're development centers for torture protocols. The word hung between them, torture. Not research, not stress testing, but the deliberate infliction of suffering for intelligence or control purposes. Marcus had known, intellectually, that the cabin represented harm, but confronting it through the lens of deliberate methodology, through understanding that his suffering had been calculated and designed for specific psychological outcomes, felt fundamentally different. Can you stop them? He asked. We're trying. The problem is legal jurisdiction, classified information, and institutional denial. Brennan's facilities operated under layers of deniability. The private contractors claim independent research authorization. The foreign funding is channeled through shell companies, and anyone who might provide testimony has reasons to remain silent. What reasons? Fear, intimidation, legal liability if they participated knowingly. And in some cases, Rodriguez paused, choosing her words carefully. In some cases, people were compensated in ways that made silence profitable. Marcus understood then that his recovery, his hospitalization, his detailed debriefing, all of it was part of a process designed to transform him from victim into witness. That his experiences, his suffering, his survival had become evidence to be used in larger institutional investigations. It should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt like a different form of captivity, one where the chains were legal and bureaucratic rather than physical, but no less constraining. On day 63 of hospitalization, Marcus was released from the military facility. Rodriguez personally drove him to a civilian airport, where he was provided with identifying documents that his experience hadn't entirely destroyed. and a small amount of cash compensation for his suffering, an amount that seemed calculated to acknowledge his experience without fully recognizing its cost. There will be ongoing psychological support available, Rodriguez explained, providing him with contact information and resources. And you should understand that your testimony may be required for legal proceedings. Federal prosecutors are building cases against Brennan and his associates. Your statement will be important. Marcus accepted the information without commitment. He understood that his cooperation would be demanded, whether he agreed to it or not, that his experience had become property of the state, evidence to be deployed for institutional purposes beyond his control or consent. He flew south toward warmth, toward places where 60-degree temperatures seemed like mythology. He found an apartment in Portland, Oregon, a city he'd never been to, chosen solely for its distance from anything connected to his previous life. He established routines, visited therapists as recommended, slowly reintegrated into civilian existence, but the experience in the cabin never left him. In quiet moments, he could still feel the cold, could still remember the silence, could still access the specific quality of desperation that comes from absolute isolation. The discovery of the research files, the radio transmission, the extraction, those moments maintained their power, their ability to reshape his understanding of reality. 6 months after his release, Rodriguez contacted him. The federal investigation had progressed. Brennan had been located in South America and was being extradited. Other researchers had been identified. Facilities had been shut down. Testimony was being gathered. "Would you be willing to testify?" Rodriguez asked. "Not just in deposition, but in court. Your testimony would be central to establishing the deliberate nature of the psychological harm." Marcus agreed, knowing that refusal would accomplish nothing except perhaps triggering his recapture under some emergency statute. He prepared for court testimony by reviewing his experience, articulating details he'd tried to suppress, transforming his suffering into narrative suitable for legal proceedings. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Brennan appeared confident, defended by expensive lawyers, surrounded by academic colleagues who testified about the legitimacy of his research questions. But Marcus's testimony, delivered calmly, with specific details about his recruitment, his imprisonment, his discoveries, gradually eroded the perception of legitimate research. The recordings from the cabin's cameras, when presented, showed a facility designed for human suffering. The medical documentation revealed sophisticated tracking of psychological degradation. The kitchen logs demonstrated deliberate caloric restriction. Brennan was convicted on multiple felony charges. The sentence was 15 years. Other researchers faced similar proceedings. Institutional reforms were promised. Federal oversight mechanisms were established. Marcus watched these developments from emotional distance, understanding that legal victory hadn't transformed his experience or restored what had been taken from him. The cabin had changed him in ways that no conviction could adequately address. But standing in the courthouse, watching federal marshals escort Brennan away, Marcus felt something shift, not closure. Closure remained impossible for trauma this profound, but perhaps a kind of completion. The cycle that had begun at a truck stop outside Fairbanks had finally concluded. His story, his experience, his suffering, all of it had been acknowledged by larger systems, had been ruled as having exceeded acceptable boundaries, had been formally recognized as harm. That recognition would have to suffice. As he exited the courthouse into afternoon sunlight, Marcus thought about the cabin. It had been decommissioned, sealed, allowed to exist in perpetual hibernation as evidence of what humans could deliberately inflict on other humans. Perhaps someday it would become a museum, a monument to institutional cruelty and governmental negligence. Perhaps it would simply remain abandoned, swallowed gradually by snow and ice and time. But Marcus would never return to it. He'd recovered what he could from that experience: survival, testimony, a detailed understanding of his own capacity for endurance. The cabin had given him nothing else that he wanted, and he refused to grant it further claim on his time or consciousness. He was alive, he was free. Those conditions, once achieved, were sufficient. Closing. That was the incredible story of Marcus Holloway's survival in the Alaskan wilderness and the institutional conspiracy that surrounded his imprisonment. If you watched this entire video, thank you for sticking with this story. Leave a comment below. I'd really love to hear what you thought about Marcus's journey and his discoveries in that cabin. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories like this one. Each video is designed to bring you real-world drama and survival stories that will keep you engaged from beginning to end. Your support means everything to growing this community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.